I never really thought much about my boss outside of work. His name was Greg, and he managed a small call center I worked at part-time. He was a quiet guy, middle-aged, wore glasses, and always seemed a little nervous, like he was hiding something. But nothing about him ever felt threatening, just awkward and weird. The call center was in a dull office building near the city. I worked the night shift, which was usually pretty boring. Most people were gone by 8 p.m., but we had to stay until midnight or later. Greg would sometimes stay late too, checking on us, but he mostly kept to himself. One night, after a long shift, I was really tired. I took the bus home around 12:30 a.m. It was raining lightly, and the streets were mostly empty except for a few cars splashing through puddles. When I got off the bus, I noticed something strange. Greg was standing across the street, just watching me. He wasn't walking toward me, just standing still, his hands in his pockets, staring. I felt uneasy but didn't want to make a scene, so I crossed quickly, keeping my head down. My apartment was just a few blocks away, a small old building with creaky floors and a rusty mailbox outside. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. The hallway smelled like damp wood and old paint. I breathed a sigh of relief. I thought maybe Greg just happened to be nearby, but it still felt weird. I went inside and started to get ready for bed. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard a soft knock on my apartment door. Heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was late and no one else knew where I lived. I looked through the peephole. It was Greg. I almost didn't believe it. Why would my boss be here? I didn't open the door. "Hey," he said quietly. "It's me, Greg. I just wanted to make sure you got home safe." I felt trapped. Should I open the door? Was he joking? I said through the door, "I'm fine, thanks." He sighed, then said, "I won't stay long. Just want to talk." I thought about calling someone, but I didn't want to make a big deal yet. I told him again, "Please leave, it's late." He didn't answer. The knocking stopped. After a few minutes, I started to relax. Then suddenly, the door handle jiggled. I froze. I tried the lock. It was still secure. But whoever was outside was trying hard to get in. My heart raced. I reached for my phone and called 911. Greg's voice came through the door again. "Listen, I'm not trying to scare you. I just want to help." His tone wasn't angry. It was strange. Like he was nervous and desperate at the same time. The operator told me the police were on their way and to stay calm. The door handle stopped moving. I pressed my ear to the door, and I could hear Greg breathing heavily on the other side. Then, footsteps walking away slowly down the hallway. I looked through the peephole. He was gone. About 10 minutes later, the police arrived and searched the area. They didn't find anyone. I told them what happened. They said they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood. I stayed at a friend's place that night. The next day, I told my manager at work what happened. He looked uncomfortable and told me Greg wasn't supposed to be near employees' homes. That afternoon, I got a text from an unknown number. It read, "Sorry about last night. I just wanted to see you. Call me when you're ready." I didn't reply. Over the next few days, things got weirder. At work, Greg was overly friendly, like nothing had happened. But sometimes, I caught him staring at me from across the room. Not in a normal way. More like he was studying me, trying to figure me out. One evening, I stayed late to finish some reports. When I got up to get coffee, I saw Greg in the break room, standing perfectly still, just staring at the floor. When he saw me, he smiled a little and said, "Long day, huh?" But his eyes were cold. The next week, I started getting texts from the same unknown number almost every night. They were strange messages like, "You don't have to be alone," or, "I know where you live." I was scared. I blocked the number. But the texts kept coming from different numbers, all with the same creepy tone. I thought about quitting, but I needed the job. One night, I was working late again. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps outside my office door. I looked up. No one was there. Then, I heard soft tapping on the glass window next to my desk. I froze. The office lights were all on, and I was alone. I slowly stood up and walked to the window. Outside, I saw Greg's face pressed against the glass. His eyes were wide and dark. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I stepped back and locked the door. That night, I called HR and reported everything. The texts, the stalking, the late-night visits. They told me they'd investigate, but Greg still came to work every day like nothing was wrong. 2 days later, I got another text. This one said, "You're going to miss me when I'm gone." I showed it to HR, and finally, they suspended Greg. I thought it was over. But then, one night, I was walking home late, again. The streets were empty, and I felt cold, even though it was summer. I heard footsteps behind me, faster steps. I turned around, but no one was there. Then, I heard a soft whisper in my ear, barely audible. "You belong to me now." I ran. I haven't worked there since. I still don't know why Greg came to my apartment that night or why he followed me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at home, I swear I can hear quiet tapping on my windows. I used to work at a small hardware store in my town. It wasn't anything fancy, just aisles of tools, paint, plumbing supplies, and that strong chemical smell that never really leaves your clothes. I was in college at the time, so the job was just a way to make rent and buy food. My boss, Rick, was in his late 50s. He was quiet most of the time, didn't smile much, and never seemed to blink enough. He had this weird habit of standing way too close when he talked to you, like just inside your personal space, enough to make you want to step back. But other than that, he wasn't rude or mean, just off. One night, maybe 2 months into the job, I was closing up. Everyone else had left. It was just me and Rick. I was cleaning the register area when he came up behind me and said, "Come down to the basement. I need your help with something." The basement was mostly used for extra stock, buckets of paint, old shelving parts, broken things we hadn't thrown out yet. I hated going down there. It always smelled like rust and wet wood, and the flickering light made everything feel old. Like time didn't work right down there. I followed Rick down the narrow wooden steps. He walked without saying anything, not even looking back to see if I was behind him. We reached the bottom and he stopped near an old metal shelf, pointing to a box on the floor. "I need you to move that. There's something behind it," he said. The box looked heavy, but I didn't ask questions. I bent down and started to drag it. It scraped against the concrete floor with a loud, echoing screech. That's when I noticed something. Behind the box wasn't a wall like I thought. It was a small wooden door, like a crawl space. "What's this?" I asked. Rick didn't answer. He just stared at the door. His eyes were wide, like he was watching something crawl out of it in his head. I stood up slowly and asked again, little louder, "Rick, what is this?" He turned to me slowly and said, "I keep the bad ones in there." I laughed, thinking it was some weird joke. But he didn't laugh. His face was completely serious. "I'm just messing with you," he said a second later, with a forced smile. "There's just some old paperwork in there. Go ahead and open it." I hesitated. Something about the way he said that made my skin crawl. But I reached for the handle anyway. It was cold. Too cold. Like it hadn't been touched in years. I opened the small door. It was pitch black inside. Just a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. The air that came out smelled like rotting paper and mildew. I didn't see any boxes or paperwork. Turned back to Rick, but he was gone. I stood there in silence, heart pounding. I could hear something behind me. A soft creaking sound, like something shifting deeper inside the tunnel. I shut the door quickly and backed away. "Rick?" I called out, louder now. No answer. I ran up the stairs, taking two at a time. When I got to the top, the door was closed. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It wouldn't budge. "Rick, this isn't funny," I yelled, banging on the door. Nothing. After a few minutes of panicking and trying to force the door open, I heard footsteps slowly coming down the stairs. But they didn't sound like Rick's heavy boots. They were slower, lighter. The door creaked, open. It was Rick. He looked down at me and smiled like nothing had happened. "You all right?" he asked calmly. "You just disappeared on me." I tried to explain what happened, but he kept denying everything. "I never told you to go down there. I thought you went home." I quit the next morning. A few weeks later, I drove by the store. It had a sign out front. "Now hiring. All shifts." Out of curiosity, I looked up the store on Facebook. There were old posts and a few missing person flyers in the comments. One of them was from 6 months before I got hired. It was a picture of a guy in a red flannel shirt. The caption said, "Last seen working the night shift at store name. No leads, no footage." He looked familiar. I remember seeing his face once, in a picture frame behind the counter. But the photo had disappeared a week after I started. Never went back. But sometimes, when I walk by the closed-down store, I swear I hear that same slow creaking sound from under the floor. I worked as a night security guard at a small office building downtown. It was nothing fancy, just a few floors of offices, mostly empty after 6 p.m. My job was simple: walk the halls every hour, check the doors, and make sure no one was sneaking. And my boss was a man named Carl. He was about 60 years old, quiet and serious. He never smiled much, but he was polite. He usually came in once a week to check on things, but mostly, I was alone at night. One night, about 2 months after I started, I got a strange call from Carl around 11 p.m. He told me he was coming to the building and would be there in 15 minutes. That was weird because he never came at night. I wasn't sure why, but I told him okay. 15 minutes later, I heard the front door open. I saw Carl walk in. He was wearing his usual gray jacket and carrying a small box. "Hey," he said. "I'm going to stay here for a while." I nodded, confused. He didn't explain why. He sat down in the main lobby, took out the box, and started unpacking old papers and some photographs. I asked if he needed help, but he shook his head. For the next few hours, he barely said a word, just looked through the papers slowly. I went about my rounds, checking doors and windows. At one point, I saw Carl standing by the elevator, staring at the buttons. His eyes looked tired, but there was something else, like he was waiting for something or someone. I asked if he wanted a coffee, but he said no. Around 2 a.m., he told me he was going to the basement to check something. I offered to go with him, but he said no. "Just wait here," he said. I watched him walk down the stairwell. The sound of his footsteps echoed and then disappeared into the darkness. Minutes passed. I started to feel uneasy. The basement wasn't a place I liked. It smelled like damp concrete and old dust. The light there flickered badly. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise coming from below. It sounded like soft tapping, like someone knocking on the walls. I thought it was just the building settling, so I tried to ignore it. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Carl appeared, but something was different. His face looked pale, and he was breathing hard. He said, "The door to the old storage room was open. I didn't leave it that way." I felt a chill. Maybe someone broke in? I asked. Carl shook his head. No one's been here except us. We decided to call the police just to be safe. While we waited, I noticed Carl kept glancing at the hallway, behind the reception desk. When I looked, I saw nothing. The police arrived and searched the basement and the offices. They found nothing unusual, no sign of forced entry. After they left, Carl looked tired and said he would leave soon. I walked him to the front door. When he opened it, he paused and looked back into the building. His eyes seemed fixed on something I couldn't see. He said, "This building has history. Things happen here that no one talks about." I asked what he meant. He smiled a little and said, "One day, you'll understand." Then he left. I thought that was the end of it. But after that night, things got strange. Every time I went into the basement, I felt like I was being watched. The tapping noises got louder, like someone knocking on the walls slowly. Sometimes, when I checked the old storage room Carl mentioned, I thought I saw shadows moving just out of sight. One night, around 4 a.m., I was walking the halls when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly. No one was there. The hallway smelled like wet concrete, and something else, something rotten. I felt cold, like a sudden breeze had passed. That night, I called Carl. He didn't answer. The next day, I went to the building early. I found a note on the receptionist's desk. It was in Carl's handwriting. It said, "If anything happens to me, don't trust what you see." I was confused and scared. I tried calling him again, but no answer. I told my supervisor and they said Carl had been out sick, but I didn't believe it. The next week, I was alone again at night. Around 1 a.m., I heard a soft voice behind me. It said, "You're not alone." I spun around. The hallway was empty. I started walking fast, but the voice followed. "Help me," it whispered. I ran to the basement stairs. When I looked down, I saw a faint light. I went down slowly, the air thick with dust. At the bottom, I found the storage room door open. Inside, there was nothing but old boxes, but I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. I screamed and ran back upstairs. I locked myself in the lobby until morning. When daylight came, I told the police everything. They said the building was empty and there was no sign anyone else had been there. I quit the job the next day. But sometimes when I walk past the building, I see a light flickering in the basement window. And late at night, I swear I can hear tapping, slow, steady knocking from inside the walls. I never thought much about my boss, Lisa, when I first started working at that small advertising agency. She was young, sharp, and a little intense. But I liked her. She was fair and always had an answer for everything. She ran the office like clockwork. I worked late nights sometimes, finishing projects at my desk while the rest of the office was empty and quiet. Lisa was usually gone by then, but one night she stayed late. I remember it well because the office was freezing cold, like the air conditioning was stuck on full blast. I kept working, typing away, when I noticed Lisa wasn't at her desk anymore. I looked around and saw her standing near the window, staring out at the dark city streets below. "Everything okay?" I asked. She didn't answer at first, just kept looking out. Finally, she said softly, "I can't sleep." I was surprised. "Why?" She shrugged. "Sometimes I come in here when I can't." I nodded, not thinking much of it. About an hour later, I packed up my things. Lisa said she was staying a bit longer, so I left quietly. That night, I slept well, but the next night was different. I was in my small apartment getting ready for bed when I heard a soft knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole. It was Lisa. I was shocked. I opened the door slowly. "Lisa, what are you doing here?" She smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was strange, almost cold. "I couldn't sleep again," she said. "Thought maybe you could help." I wanted to say no, but something made me let her in. We sat in my living room. She was quiet, just watching me. I started to feel uneasy. After a while, I told her it was late and she should go home. She nodded and left. I locked the door and tried to shake off the weird feeling. A few nights later, I was working late again, at the office. Around midnight I felt tired, so I took a short break and closed my eyes for a minute at my desk. When I opened them, I saw Lisa standing over me. She didn't say a word. I felt frozen, like I couldn't move or speak. Her eyes were dark and focused. I quickly stood up and said, "You scared me." She smiled again, then walked away. I thought maybe she was just lonely or stressed, but the feeling stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, Lisa kept showing up at strange times. Sometimes at my apartment, sometimes at the office after hours. She never explained why. One night I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. I sat up. The door creaked open slowly. Lisa stepped inside. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," she said softly. I was terrified. I told her to leave, but she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me. Her eyes seemed different that night, like she wasn't really there. I felt a cold hand brush my arm. I snapped out of it and told her again to go. She smiled and left. After that night, I started feeling watched everywhere I went. At work, at home. Even when I was out with friends. Stopped answering her calls, but the texts didn't stop. They said things like, "I see you," and "I'm always close." One morning, I came to work and found a small camera sitting on my desk. There was no note. I asked around, but no one knew where it came from. When I looked through it, I found video clips of me, at home, sleeping, cooking, even walking outside. I felt sick. I took the camera to HR, but they said they couldn't do much without proof of who put it there. Lisa never admitted anything. I decided to quit. The day I left, Lisa gave me a strange smile. "Don't be scared," she said. "I only wanted to be close." I never saw her again. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I see a shadow in the corner of my room. And sometimes I feel a cold breath on my neck, like someone is still watching me. I worked at a small marketing firm located in an old building downtown. The company wasn't big, just a handful of employees, and my boss, Greg, was in his late 50s. He was a quiet man, always calm, but there was something off about him that I couldn't explain at first. I started the job in the summer. The office was on the third floor of a building that felt more like a converted apartment than a proper office space. The hallways smelled faintly of mildew, and the lights sometimes flickered. Greg was always the first one in, and the last one out. Most days he stayed long after the rest of us had gone home. I thought it was just dedication. One evening, I was working late, finishing a presentation due the next morning. It was around 10 p.m., and the office was mostly empty except for me and Greg. I noticed the janitor had already locked the lower floors, and the only way out was through the front door on our floor. Greg was sitting at his desk, quietly typing, on his computer. Suddenly, he stood up and looked toward the hallway. "You're still here," he said softly. "Yeah, just finishing up," I replied. He nodded and walked toward the window, staring out into the dark street below. After a few minutes, he came back and said, "I'm going to the basement. Need to check something." I offered to come with him, but he shook his head. "Just keep an eye on things up here," he said. I watched him walk away, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty office. Minutes passed, then half an hour. I started feeling uneasy. The basement door was old and rusty, with a small window that was too dirty to see through clearly. I wasn't sure why, but I decided to check the basement door. It was wide open. I called out, "Greg?" No answer. I grabbed a flashlight from the supply closet and slowly walked down the stairs. The basement smelled like damp earth and mold. The air was thick and cold, making my breath visible. I shined the light around but saw nothing unusual. Then I heard a soft noise, like whispering coming from the far corner. I moved closer, heart pounding. The whispering stopped. The basement was silent again. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, even though the windows were shut. I turned to leave, but caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving quickly behind a pillar. I froze. "Greg," I whispered. No answer. I hurried back upstairs and locked the basement door. When I got back to the office, Greg was sitting at his desk, typing as if nothing happened. I asked him about the open basement door. He smiled slightly and said, "I was down there earlier. I must have forgotten to close it." I didn't press him. The next day, I asked other employees if they ever heard or saw strange things in the building. One woman said, "Sometimes at night, I hear footsteps in the basement, but no one is down there." Another said, "Greg stays so late, I wonder if he lives here." I laughed it off, but the more nights I worked late, the more I noticed Greg's strange behavior. He started disappearing for long stretches during the night. Sometimes he'd be gone for hours without explanation. One night, I stayed until 2 a.m. Around that time, I went to get a drink from the kitchen when I heard quiet humming coming from the hallway. I followed the sound and found Greg standing outside the elevator, eyes closed, humming a slow, low tune. When he saw me, he stopped suddenly. "Hey," I said, "everything okay?" He nodded but looked tired. Then he asked me to come with him. We walked to the basement. The lights flickered again as we went down. Greg stopped in front of a locked door I hadn't noticed before. "This room has been sealed for years," he said, quietly. He pulled out a large old key and unlocked it. The door creaked open. Inside was a small, dark room filled with old office furniture covered in dust. There were old files stacked in boxes and a broken filing cabinet. "What is this place?" I asked. Greg hesitated. "Years ago, someone worked here who didn't leave," he said slowly. I looked confused. He continued. "He was my predecessor. He disappeared one night, but his office was found just like this, untouched." A cold chill ran down my spine. Greg said, "Some say he's still here." I laughed nervously. Suddenly the room grew colder. I saw a shadow move behind the filing cabinet. I blinked, but it was gone. Greg looked serious and said, "I come here sometimes to make sure." "Make sure of what?" I asked. He didn't answer. That night, I left the office quickly. When I got home, I felt watched. The next morning, I called in sick. But something kept me thinking about Greg and that sealed room. A few days later, I decided to check the building one last time. I went back during the day, and the office was empty. I tried to find the locked door, but it was gone, replaced by a plain wall. I asked the janitor if he knew anything. He just shook his head and said, "That room's been closed up for years. No one's been in there for a long time." I left, feeling like the whole thing was a dream, but I wasn't ready to forget. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. It read, "I never left." I didn't respond. Days later, I heard a knock on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole. No one was there. When I opened the door, the apartment smelled like damp earth and old paper. I closed the door quickly. Sometimes, I still think about Greg in the secret room. Sometimes when I'm alone, I hear humming, soft and low, like someone is waiting. And I wonder, was Greg telling the truth? Is someone still in that building? Someone who never left.